Hello again, and welcome to lecture number 14 in our series on the foundations of Western civilization. Over the last several lectures, we talked in various ways and from various points of view about the Greek polis. We talked about it as a political and social institution in connection with Athens and Sparta. We talked about its public arts, drama, architecture, for example. We talked about history as a way in which the polis reflected on itself and carried on conversations with itself. And then we talked about the philosophical culture that emerged in these remarkable Greek cities. Now we have a less happy task. We must dismantle the polis. Or actually, to be more accurate, we must watch the Greeks dismantling their own polis. For in the end, the polis failed. As we move along, we'll have one or two reflections on why that would have been the case, and why perhaps it's important that that was the case. Suffice it to say for the moment, by way of introduction, that the 4th century, the period after the Peloponnesian Wars, was an extremely difficult period for the Greek world. Eventually, the Greek world fell to the Macedonians to the north. But difficulties were not unprecedented. Difficulties did not arise in the 4th century for the first time. We could go all the way back, for example, to the time of the Persian Wars. There were very, very sharp differences, depending on where you lived in Greece, as to what your views were on the proper strategies to be deployed in fighting the Persians. If you lived far to the north, you wanted the defense lines there. If you lived far to the south, you wanted the defense lines there. And there were some people who took one look around and Medized, went over to the Persians. They thought, these guys are going to win. We better get on the winning side right away. Well, they obviously were treated rather harshly when, in fact, the Greeks won. During the Peloponnesian Wars, which followed a generation after the Persian Wars, most of the Greek world was dragged into the battle. Athens and her empire on the one hand, Sparta and her Peloponnesian League on the other hand, fought a long and brutal and ugly and nasty war. A war which made brutality a regular part of life, which coarsened public life, which coarsened public debate. Sparta won, finally, if one can say that anybody really won this war. Throughout the Athenian democracy, which the Spartans believed, perhaps they'd made hobgoblins in their mind, but they believed that it had been the Athenian democracy that had been the problem for all this. You'll recall Thucydides had said actually it was Sparta's inordinate fear of Athens that had generated this war. When the Spartans introduced a regime into Athens, the 30 tyrants as they came to be called, sort of 30 rather brutal right-wing thugs who were supposed to keep control over the Athenian situation. These fellows discredited themselves pretty quickly, and a moderate democracy was restored, but it was really only a shadow of its former self. But in the very last stages of the Peloponnesian War, something, in the Greek context, almost unthinkable had happened. Spartans were landlubbers, and the Athenians had a great navy. Now, the Athenians had actually lost big chunks of their navy on several occasions during the Peloponnesian War, but it became pretty clear that to defeat Athens, Sparta needed resources beyond its own infantry forces. They turned to Persia, the unthinkable. They allied with the ancient enemy. Well, that meant that for a generation after the conclusion of the Peloponnesian War, the Greek world was in a kind of an uneasy balance. From one point of view, Sparta was dominant. From another point of view, it was really Persia that was dominant, because Persia provided Sparta with the resources and with the manpower and with the military power to maintain their authority. Well, eventually, various of the Greek cities chafed under Spartan domination and under this Persian intrusion into the Greek world, something which for at least some of them was just unthinkable. The most prominent among those who felt this sense of distress at this control of the Greek world by the Spartans, by the Persians, were those of the city of Thebes. Thebes produced, in the 360s BC, 370s BC, a series of very, very able, very capable kings, very capable rulers, who gradually achieved what we refer to as the Theban hegemony. They basically now subjected most of Greece to Theban rule. Well, the Greeks chafed then under Theban rule. And Athens once again forged an alliance of a large number of Greek cities designed to overthrow the rule of Thebes. The Athenians were basically successful in doing this. And they then began to form a much smaller version of their old empire. We call this the Second Athenian Empire. But for the most part, most Greek cities were simply not going to let Athens get too big for its britches again. They remembered the Athens of the 5th century. They wanted no part of that. So the Athenian Empire of the 4th century had been strong enough to lead in defeating Thebes, but was not strong enough to dominate Greece. It was relatively weak. Meanwhile, whilst the Greeks are squabbling amongst themselves, storm clouds were gathering in the north. The kingdom of Macedon was consolidating its position. Now, the Macedonians, the northern neighbors of the Greeks, were people with whom the Greeks had had various kinds of contacts over the years. They knew vaguely who these people were. They had traded with them and so on. But the Greeks, honestly, had not thought very much about the Macedonians. The Greeks called the Macedonians barbarians, but indeed the Greeks called everybody barbarians. You know, don't you hate people who say, well, there's only two kinds of people in the world, and they proceed to divide the world into two kinds of people? Well, the Greeks, in fact, divided the world into two kinds of people. There were those who spoke Greek and those who didn't. Now, there was a very clear negative connotation here. I mean, we who speak Greek are clearly better than they who do not. But essentially, it was descriptive. There are those who speak Greek and those who don't. Those who don't speak Greek, the Greeks thought, babbled. They were incomprehensible. So the Greeks even made up a word. They took two nonsense syllables and put a Greek ending on it. Barbaros. So a barbaros is a babbler who goes ba 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 ba. But then by extension becomes the barbarian, the foreigner, the alien, the one who does not speak our language. Gradually then, of course, barbarian comes to acquire a whole series of other sort of cultural and ethical connotations. But initially, they don't speak Greek. So the Greeks called the Macedonians barbarians. And this meant, well, they're like us. They don't speak our language. Macedon's kings, in point of fact, were not barbarians at all. They were very accomplished rulers, very capable rulers. By conquering a very large set of silver mines, they got access to very substantial financial resources that enabled them to undertake substantial building projects, that enabled them to win or to buy, if you will, substantial human and material resources in the development of their kingdom. So the Macedonian kingdom then was slowly but surely gathering force, gathering power. Under King Philip II, 382 to 336 BC, we find a man who was a particularly accomplished soldier, in fact, a very gifted military leader, a reasonably cultivated man. We know from, for example, his palace complex, we know from his art, that this was a man of some heightened aesthetic sensibilities. And then, after all, this is the man who hired Aristotle to tutor his son, little Alexander, about whom more in a few minutes. He was ambitious, too. This seems to have been something that ran in the blood of these Macedonian kings. One of the most ambitious people who ever lived was his son, Alexander. So the Greek world has been through 150 years of problems, of struggles, of quarrels, of controversies. These quarrels and controversies have been occasioned by instability inside individual Greek polis and by constant battles between and among the Greek polis. Pause for just a moment and think with me. Whatever else it may have been, the Greek polis as an independent city-state, as a fiercely independent city-state, was at the very heart of Greek thinking about government and social organization. And yet, from really the end of the archaic period, right to the middle of the 4th century, the point we have reached now, it is leagues and alliances and associations and empires constantly fighting one another. In a very curious way, that's not supposed to happen. We're supposed to have all of these tiny and fiercely independent cities. And yet what we have are shifting coalitions, this group against that group, another group against yet another. The polis had, quite simply, failed as an effective agent of political organization. But as the polis is failing before the Greeks' eyes, and as Macedon is emerging, before their eyes as well, to the extent that they were paying attention, down in the Greek world, we begin to see some very interesting reflections on government. Some of these very much attuned to the issues of the day. Some of these, we might almost say, bewilderingly out of step with what people ought to have been able to see with their own two eyes. In a sense, we can say that certain people, Plato and Aristotle, so we're going to come back to them for a moment or two, were imagining ideal kinds of states. Well, they may have been occasioned to think of ideal states because the ones they had sure didn't seem to work very well. And then other thinkers were elaborating an idea, a complex of ideas that we call Panhellenism, all Greekism, a way of trying to forge the Greeks together. All right, ideal solutions first then, in the midst of all this trouble, all this struggle, all this chaos. Aristotle, and I hope you'll recall that we had mentioned this in an earlier lecture, had said that man is a political animal. That is to say, man is an animal who by nature lives in a polis. So Aristotle was not willing to abandon the polis as the locus for his thinking about government, about politics, and so on. Indeed, he and his pupils, and I repeat a point again that I had made in an earlier lecture, studied 158 of them. You may recall my mentioning we don't have all of those studies. It would be wonderful if we did. Aristotle himself studied the Constitution of Athens. In reflecting on all of these different kinds of political organizations, all of these polis that had existed at one time or another, in one place or another, and I think, too, in reflecting on the inescapable reality of the history that these polis, the rather sad history that these polis had made over some 100, 150 years, let's say since the Persian Wars, Aristotle began to think about how a state might actually be organized. He said that in the first place, a state should be governed by a few, by an oligarchy. Oligos in Greek means few, archy again means rule, so an oligarchy is a rule by a few. Which few? Well, that seems self-evident to Aristotle, and probably would to any of us, if we thought about it for a minute. The best. We want the best citizens to rule. Hoi aristoi. We want aristocracy. Now, you'll recall perhaps when we were talking about the critiques of democracy, of Periclean democracy, that there were a number of writers who said that one of the problems here is that it does not bring forward the best. So in a sense, and Aristotle was one of those critics, thinking back about that earlier time, but now in a sense we see that thinking in its own context and in its own time. Aristotle has watched what has happened over a long period, and he said, we must somehow bring forward the best. Well, you know, in a lot of ways, that's an unobjectionable proposition. It's pretty hard to disagree with that. We could disagree with the idea of the few, but it's hard to disagree with the idea that we ought to be governed by our best. What Aristotle wasn't so clear on, how many should the few be? Probably not very many. Aristotle once said, for example, that a state should be no larger than all its citizens could be assembled by the cry of a herald. So what the few who led them might be is hard to say. How would we get the best? Aristotle goes very fuzzy on us there. By what process would we identify, promote, bring forward, and reconcile others to the rule of the best? So Aristotle is quite content to say things haven't worked as well as they should have done over a long period of time. What we need is a small number of rulers who are the best, but how do we get them? Well, he didn't help us very much on that particular point. Plato, meanwhile, thinks also about ideal states. He thinks of a state where kings would be philosophers and philosophers would be kings. Now, you may recall that in the last lecture, when we talked about Plato and his idea of a moral society, he imagined the soul of an individual as made up of reason and courage and appetites. And he said that each of us is probably not perfectly arrayed, and so indeed, as each of us is not arrayed, so our societies are not arrayed so as to reflect this sort of transcendent reality. For the moment, though, I just want to draw your attention back to the highest of these qualities, reason, nous, mind. So from Plato's point of view, it stood to reason that in an ideal state, those best in mind should be entrusted with rule. They would be most apt to this task. Plato reckons that this will not be a large group. He does say, for example, that this is not attributable to birth, it is not attributable to wealth, it is not attributable to social class, and he even said he thought it improbable, but it could apply to women. That women could be among the governing class. He thought it improbable, unlikely, but he said it's possible. That's a rather interesting notion. But Plato leaves us also with a kind of an interesting problem. If we're going to have a relatively small number of people, marked particularly by their intellectual capacity, by reason, and these are the people who will make laws, who will implement laws, who will oversee the system, how do we choose them? Who are they? Where do we get them? How do we find them? How do we bring them forward? How do we reconcile others to them? Just like his pupil Aristotle, Plato sort of fails us at that point. He doesn't actually tell us how we're going to do this. Though it is interesting, is it not, that Plato and Aristotle finally, on reflecting on the nature of the polis as historical experience or as intellectual proposition, both arrive at oligarchy. Both arrive at rule by a few. Now, mind you, they don't quite tell us how many, you see. They don't tell us quite how we're going to get them, and so on. But they say rule by a few. I don't know about all of you. For those of us in the academic world, it's a nightmare to think of government by committee. But in any case, that's something like what was proposed here. All right, so some people in the Greek world are now thinking about ideal states. They're basically looking around and saying, you know, what we've got's not so hot. What about an ideal state? There are others, perhaps a bit more realistic, perhaps a bit more pragmatic, who are looking at the world around them and say, well, you know, we got to deal with what's here. What are we going to do? One of the first of these is Isocrates. Mind the I. Isocrates, not Socrates. He's born in 436 BC, dies in 338. He gave rise to a doctrine called Panhellenism, all Greekism. What does this mean? Isocrates' great dream, his great hope, his great desire, was to unite all the Greeks, Athens and Sparta in the lead, in a great crusade against Persia. Now, there's something very interesting going on here. There is a creative process going on here. Isocrates is imagining a past at the time of the Persian Wars, when all the Greeks were united, when they stood as one, when they faced the common foe. Well, as I told you a few minutes ago, the Greek world was not united at the time of the Persian Wars. They did not stand as one. They did not share ideas about how to fight the enemy, and as we've seen, they sure didn't share ideas about what should happen after the war. But Isocrates is now inventing a history of the age of the Persian Wars as a way of telling the Greeks, once we were united, let us unite again. Let us put aside our petty squabbling and bickering. Let us unite and fight the great enemy, Persia. And in Isocrates' own lifetime, the Persians had been sort of hired guns by the Spartans, although very well may be the case that, as often with the mercenary realizes the person hiring him isn't strong enough already, or they wouldn't need them, and so the Persians were probably in control here. Well, realizing that the Greeks would not bow to their own, they were not going to unify under Sparta, they had enough of that. They were not going to unify under Athens, they'd had enough of that. Isocrates hatches the scheme of having the Greeks unify under Philip of Macedon to go and fight the Persians. Isocrates has a foe in Demosthenes. 384 to 322, the greatest of the Greek orators, indeed perhaps the greatest orator of antiquity. You may know the stories of Demosthenes as a small boy who had a speech impediment, and he went down to the seacoast and put pebbles in his mouth and shouted over the sound of the waves, even with a mouthful of pebbles, until he learned to speak not only correctly, but powerfully and persuasively. Now, we can say certainly that Demosthenes fits in the tradition of the sophists, persons who had learned to use language in elegant ways, in artful ways, but also in ways that would be persuasive. In any case, Demosthenes raises his voice in defense of the autonomy, the independence, the validity of the polis. We could say, what was he thinking? Couldn't he see what was going on in his world? But that was his great commitment. That was his great vision. He also would have wished for a war against Persia. That seems pretty clear. He would have wished for a war against Persia. But unlike Isocrates, who would have invited the Greeks to unify under Philip of Macedon to fight the Persians, Demosthenes saw Philip as the great threat, as the greater threat to Greek liberty. He delivered a series of 4 Philippic orations, orations against Philip. The point of these lectures, of these orations, was to warn the Greeks that the great danger to their liberty was from Macedon. Now, exactly what Demosthenes imagined was possible is hard to say. Did he imagine that the Greeks would somehow be able to unify under one of the Greek cities or in some kind of an alliance? He even seems to have entertained the possibility that the Greeks might ally with the Persians against the Macedonians, even though he had begun hoping for a sort of a Greek alliance against the Persians. But in the end, neither Demosthenes nor Isocrates quite had it his own way. Amidst this welter of wars, alliances, scheming, ideal states, real states, practical ideas, impractical ideas, Philip attacked. Was he invited to do so by what he could see over his border, these quarrelsome, meddlesome Greeks? Did Isocrates encourage him to come south? Did Demosthenes simply make him mad? It's hard to say. It's hard to say. What we do know is that he attacked. And near the city of Thebes, at Chaeronea, in 338, he won a great victory over a combined Greek force. Now, Philip destroyed much of the nearby city of Thebes, but he demonstrated his sort of cultural proclivities by leaving standing the house of the poet Pindar. Flattened everything else. The Battle of Chaeronea is interesting to us for another reason as well. The attacking wing, the wheeling wing, the cavalry wing, the wing that delivered the victory that day, was led by an 18-year-old boy named Alexander. We'll hear more about him. Well, Philip, having conquered the Greeks, it really in one great battle, now created a league. He created a kind of a league. These leagues and alliances and so on have been going on in the Greek world for a long time now. He creates a league with himself at the head. In a sense, he creates a league where all of the Greeks have a vote, and he has a vote, and he has a veto, and they don't. So Philip is basically in charge in the Greek world. His aim, I think, was to provide peace and order in the Greek world, but I think the kind of peace and order that meant he really didn't want to be bothered by these guys. He wanted to sort of impose peace rather more than elicit peace, because eliciting it was unlikely to work. And then he began making preparations to attack Persia. Now, it's very interesting to ask here, would Philip all on his own have formed the idea of making war on the Persians? Was this something suggested to him, for example, by Isocrates in particular, but maybe by other Greeks as well? It's just hard to say. But he clearly had begun making preparations for a war against Persia. 336, he was killed in a palace intrigue. The Macedonian court was often a tumultuous and difficult place, and unfortunately we don't have quite rich enough and detailed enough sources to say exactly what was going on. Anyway, there was a palace intrigue. Philip was killed. It took a short period of time before his son Alexander was able to win out among several potential claimants for the Macedonian throne. Alexander was 20. He immediately had to sort of patch up relations with a number of his father's most important associates and supporters, and with a number of the most important military commanders in the Macedonian army. But once he had managed to sort of patch up these relations, he decided on what would become, as we know, with the luxury of hindsight, his life's work, to go and make war on the Persians. Alexander is a quite remarkable and quite mysterious figure. He was a very tall man, a very handsome man, apparently. He was athletic, he was intelligent, he was charismatic. But he was also ruthless and immeasurably ambitious. Few people, I think, have ever been more ambitious than Alexander. He was ideologically clever. For a young man, he was pretty smart. He depicted his war against Persia as a crusade to even the score for this long-ago Persian attack on the Greeks. He makes himself the great defender of the Greeks, the great defender of Greek liberty, the great avenger of Greek humiliation. Well, gee, you know, the Greeks hadn't been humiliated. They won that war. And the Greeks had in some ways brought that war on themselves by implicating themselves in the Ionian revolt. But just as for his purposes, Isocrates had managed the history of the Peloponnesian War, so now Alexander, for his own purposes, managed, I said Peloponnesian War, I meant Persian War, of course. Alexander now, for his purposes, manages the history of the Persian Wars. Now, this is a wonderful object lesson and a point that I've made many times. There's a history that happens and a history that's remembered. Here we're watching two people battling over the same history and each using fictitious versions of it. Quite interesting, that. He was using all of this as a cover for sheer imperialism. Alexander set out to conquer the world. Yes, we have that legendary account of how at one point he sat upon a stone and wept for lack of worlds to conquer. That's probably not true, but it's interesting that someone would tell that story about Alexander. He used the campaigns as a very clever way to distract and to reward the great Macedonian nobles who had been responsible for all these palace intrigues, who might at any point turn against him. Still, having said that, and having appreciated that Alexander was pretty savvy politically, pretty savvy ideologically, for a young person who, after all, had not had a lot of experience of the world, we shouldn't minimize the extent of his military achievement. Alexander was a great military leader, whatever else we may say about him. With an army of about 35,000 men at the height, it's as large as it ever got, he conquered the Persian Empire. He marched into the Persian Empire and one after another won a series of great battles, systematically dismantled the Persian military apparatus, and brought it all into his own hands. And he then marched beyond the Persian Empire. He marched into Central Asia. He marched into northern India. His tactics were brilliant. Alexander is still studied today for his military tactics. How do you learn that? As a young boy. He sets out to conquer the Persian Empire at the age of 18. His earliest great victories come in the next 2 or 3 years. He's 20, 21, 22 years old. And he's up against the greatest military establishment in the then world. And he beats them. He led his own troops. He sometimes acted recklessly, some might say. But he had a remarkable capacity to elicit loyalty, to make men follow him, to make men do what seemed somehow impossible. And as if all of that weren't impressive enough, Alexander organized astonishing supply lines. One of the things he recognized was he was moving further and further and further and further away from the Greek world, from supplies, from everything he needed to accomplish his great military objectives. And yet he organized supply lines. He organized the provision of materiel and of food to his troops over an enormous network. Where did he learn all of that? Hard to say. It's long been thought that Alexander was a very cosmopolitan figure, that he fostered a kind of a multicultural world. Well, we're going to talk about the world Alexander made in our next lecture. For now, we can say, well, he incorporated foreigners into his command structure. That's true. That may indicate a certain lack of prejudice or a certain willingness to incorporate. He married an Asian princess. That's true. That may indicate a certain sensitivity to local cultures, a certain willingness to accept them. He promoted the study of the regions that he conquered. He brought all kinds of scientists and naturalists along with him who collected all sorts of information about all these remarkable places that he went and visited. Well, maybe this is the influence of his tutor, Aristotle. Aristotle may have taught him this curiosity for the world, probably didn't teach him his ambition, his dreams, his hopes. What might they have been? We'll never know. He died shortly before his 33rd birthday, died probably of malaria, which just goes to prove that mortality afflicts us all, as Gilgamesh and Enkidu learned, much to their great displeasure. He left behind no institutions. He left behind no plans. We have no idea, for example, what he might have done had he lived to be 40, 50. How would he have organized this world? What would he have done with it? Would he have gone back to the Greek world? We just don't know. What Alexander leaves us with, crucially, in the Western tradition, is a period and a set of problems that we call Hellenistic. We'll turn to those in more detail in our next lecture. Suffice it to say, this is a world where Greek values, Greek ideas, Greek culture came to dominate the Mediterranean basin. Because of the Hellenistic world, because of the sheer scale of Alexander's empire building, we have a Hellenistic civilization, a civilization based on Greek roots, which informs, which infuses Western civilization as a whole, and not merely a Greek civilization, which, having had its period of brilliance, died and passed away. But how to turn so much of that Mediterranean world even more Greek than it already was is what we shall try to explain in our lecture on the Hellenistic world next time.